is the last story of our program. This one is called The City Across the River by Michelle Qiao. The boy stood with the wind in his eyes, mud beneath his feet, 7 years in his pocket, and the city across the river stretched out before him. It was the spring of 1906. He peeked back at the home he was about to leave, frail arms trembling with nervous anticipation. Somewhere in the swamps, draped in fog, he knew his parents and 11 siblings were already up in the rice fields. With too many mouths to feed, his father was sending him into the city to be an apprentice, an exhilarating opportunity for the boy. There he had a chance at a better life, one that had never arisen even in his wildest dreams. He drank in the sweet, balmy air around him and stepped with resolve into the old ferry that would carry him to his destination. The path of life stretched out seemingly endlessly before him, disappearing around hills and diving into valleys, taking turns that seemed surreal. Across the river stood the city, shimmering arms wide open and ready to embrace him. His master was a no-nonsense sort of man. Although harsh, you had to say this, he was a legend at his trade, which was shoemaking. The boy was now an apprentice. His day started before dawn and ended well past sunset, body limp with exhaustion from pounding leather and casting rubber heels. In exchange, he got 3 things: shelter, food, and knowledge. He loved it. 11 years flew by. He couldn't be called an apprentice anymore and was a shoemaker in his own right. The day he left, his master embraced him as an equal. With a look of pride mingled with melancholy, he gazed at the boy's disappearing figure, head bobbing like a buoy in the harbor, rising and falling with each wave. The master took one last look, then stooped back under the old wooden door frame, then back into his shop. He was running behind on orders. The boy had built a reputation brick by brick, managing to open a shop of his own. He had just unlocked the doors one morning when the man with strange hair stepped in. Our shoemaker was left with mouth tilted slightly open. Foreigners were rare in this part of the city. They managed to communicate through hand motions, and the man went out the door, a loyal customer. This was the gossip of everyone within a 10-block radius for a week. He eventually managed to teach himself some English at a time where nobody knew a word. This circulated for a clean month. He put all of his heart into his craft, never letting success blind him. He worked harder with each passing day. Soon, he had enough business to open a large store and buy his own house. As dependable as the rooster's crow, the sound of a mallet thudding on leather rang out every morning, mingling with rickshaw wheels rumbling on cobblestones and the smell of fried dough. He had never had the privilege of formal education. He didn't even know how to read. All the boy knew was the language of leather and thread, and that was enough. There had always been a pair of eyes peering out the neighbor's window, fringed with black lace and in full bloom. They had gazed out at the boy many a morning. They belonged to the daughter of a merchant whose shop was next door. Marriage was a simple thing back then. It was settled on a rainy day, the water washing away all past grievances. He was to be a diligent husband, she a hard-working wife. The boy had pushed off far from the docks and was soaring with the wind in his sails and the open sea before him. But a storm would soon come, waves lashing at his ship for 17 endless years. 2 annihilating wars had stripped the shoemaker, now a father, of his home and his business. The newly formed government had decreed that all privately owned institutions had to be turned over. There was still bigger heartbreak ahead of him. He would have given all the material things in his life had he been able to save his wife, but alas, death didn't bargain. She died in premature labor, screams still ringing through the too-dead air, the baby gone with her. He was the one left standing in the bitter rain with a family to feed. The seams of his life were ripping apart, leather cracking, dirty soles rubbed bare. He tumbled into sickness, paralyzed by the fever of fear ravaging his mind, his footprints trampled and obscured. But there was always his daughter there, coaxing homemade medicine down his throat. There was always his son, coming home with the money his father couldn't earn them. Somewhere in his mind, he realized that his children would be orphaned and homeless if he died, and his will to live was awakened, a roaring beast, bursting through the chains of grief. Within a week, the father's up on his feet and had gotten new work in a factory. His leather and love had been burned, but he himself wasn't ready to become ashes. His daughter was only 11 when she lost the money, the month's salary he had given her to carry home. When she had gotten back, she realized the 10 crumpled bills were gone, dropped on the muddy street and picked up by a disgustingly fortunate stranger. That was their food for the month. They would starve on the streets without it. Face trembling with shame and tears tumbling down her cheeks, she had gone to her father. He didn't hit or even punish her, just looked down sadly. They went to the friends and neighbors and borrowed enough to get them through the month, paying it back over a year. The daughter never lost anything again in her life. He resented having to borrow, hated seeing his daughter so distraught over money that would have been trivial before the war. Every day for the next 20 years, you would see him walking down the street to the factory, nodding to street vendors and neighbors, a lunch of tea eggs swinging in his hand. Those were hard times, but he had work to do. Sitting on his rusty balcony, a peculiar sort of emotion hung in the air around him. His figure, though hunched, was still full of the vivacious spirit and tenacity of his youth. He had kept afloat all these years, rising and falling with the current. His children had grown up and were gone now, out in the city. Of course, they still loved him. He watched his grandchildren grow, wrinkled eyes lifting into a smile as they recited poems from school. He was satisfied to know that they were reaping the harvest he so painstakingly plowed and sowed for them. Over the 89 years of his long life, he had been a boy, an apprentice, a shoemaker, a father, a husband, a grandparent, and a legacy. 112 years after he crossed the river to the city, the boy's great-granddaughter had crossed an ocean to come back to it. She gazed out with wonder, eyes wide and lips slightly parted. Its almost ethereal columns rose above rippling clouds, humming with the sweet sound of life. Unaccountable stories shrouded in mystery were hidden in the folds of its gown. Unaccountable tales had begun and ended there. The city the boy had seen was long gone. In its place was one that would never have been in his wildest dreams. Ripening stars hung on branches in the sky, the fruit of the heavens. She could almost see the old man pick one with a smile that lifted the corners of his wrinkled face and offer it to her. The heavens were in his eyes, the sky was beneath him, 89 years were in his pocket, and the city across the river stretched out before him.